Welcome back to Lokad TV. Generative AI, be it ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion, is everywhere these days, not only in supply chain. But is this a net positive or negative? Here to explain to us, Joannes and Conor. Welcome.
Hello, Conor.
Pleasure to have you. So, Joannes, let's set the table a little bit. What exactly is generative AI? What is its purpose? Because it's everywhere these days.
Yes, generative AI is basically a collection of proposed solutions to the very old generative problem. So the generative problem is you have collections of objects, in their digital representation, and you want to find an algorithm, a method, a recipe to generate one more instance. And by the way, those sort of problems have been going on for decades. And for decades, for I would say small, narrow situations, there has been plenty of generators, and this could be, for example, there has been for decades generator that can generate the name of a realistic sounding location in England,
or a name from the Ramones. You can do that.
Exactly,
as well.
You can do that for, or you can, or even a realistic sounding title for, let's say, a Stephen King novel, this sort of things. Similarly, if you that was text. Similarly, if you wanted to go into images, for example, there was like generators that would generate a map that looks a bit like Lord of the Ring, with this sort of fantasy medieval vibe with little mountains, little forest, coast, fancy names all over the map, etc., etc. So the bottom line is that the idea of having like a generator has been floating around for decades, and that has been, I would say, the progress has been fairly incremental, and the path was to get the generator, I would say, broader and broader, and leveraging more and more input data sets as opposed to leveraging an extensive set of pre-coded rules. And that's where I would say where we stand, decades into the process. And last year, there was, I think, the community, the machine learning, the broader machine learning community reached two very notable milestones. With ChatGPT for text and Stable Diffusion for images. However, I would like to point out, those were milestones in the sense that the sort of accessibility of those tools was an order of magnitude better than what was before. But if we look at the fundamentals, that they were very incremental. So, it was not like a breakthrough in the sense of, new fundamental discovery about statistics or mathematics or computer science.
Just finesse.
But it was more like those were, both for image and for text, the first sort of products that were packaged enough, polished enough, so that you could literally, a layman can literally get started in minutes and play with it. If there were a previous iteration, for example, on the image front, for over a decade, there has been through generative adversarial networks, GAN, there has been tools to generate very nice images, but those tools came with tons of quirks. So you could obtain good results, but you had to be a little bit of an expert to get it to work. And where Stable Diffusion proved itself, as remarkable, was that literally enter a prompt, beautiful castle in the middle of the forest, and then you would get an image that would be, I would say 20% of the time correct. So it's
not perfect. You have to finesse it. You have to work with it and guide it.
Exactly. You have to iterate, but I would say it was like a 20% hit compared to the sort of previous generation that were like a 1% hit.
An order of magnitude improvement.
Exactly. So and same thing with ChatGPT. By the way, the sort of ChatGPT that became popular was actually a variant of a model that was already around for a couple of years. So it was literally something that had been repackaged, but in a way that was making it much more, I would say, accessible. And again, it was a matter of usability. And so I think the milestone was in 2022, generative AI became widely accessible, as opposed to be uncovered or that there was something truly fundamental happening. It was really a matter of pure usability.
Well, on that point, because again, growing up, I recall the examples of those generative websites, like the "Give me a Ramone's name." I mean, I use that famous example. I think Childish Gambino, the musician, he generated his name through a similar website. But I mean, I was not familiar with the previous iterations of ChatGPT, because this is the third, or the current iteration is the third. So what exactly about last year's releases, like Stable Diffusion and ChatGPT, the third iteration, what exactly about these evolutions just caught the attention of the public? Because they're everywhere now.
Yeah. So what again, I think in those two cases, in those two instances, what caught the attention of the public was that researcher teams, paid enough, made enough effort into the packaging of the tech. Stable Diffusion was literally released as open source. So if you were, I would say, if you were a little bit familiar with, let's say, a Python environment, even if you don't know much about Python, you could, in, let's say, 2 hours, set up an environment, a Python programming environment that would, includes all the moving parts, and just play with that on your own. And you didn't even have to be like a Python programmer. You just had to be fluent enough to execute, series of command lines. There were various tutorials. So Stable Diffusion, it was literally image generation, accessible if you can, play with the command line, which is not a super high bar. You have to be it's a little bit geekish, but it's not like over the top. And there was even a free user interface with a web app, that's the Dream Studio, where you could play for free for something like 100 images, and then afterward you have to pay something like $10 to generate the 100 next images also. So that was making it very accessible. And OpenGPT was, again, a web app, just a small registration. And nowadays you have to pay, if you want, something like €20 a month if you want to gain access to that. But the interesting thing is that in both cases, you could access the generator in a broad sense in matter of, let's say, an hour. Even you need a bit of, I would say, of experience to start getting, the feel of the tool. But again, it was orders of magnitude less compared to what was before. Now, in terms of true progression, the interesting thing is that the way I see that is that those generators have been progressing on two fronts for decades. One front is the dimensionality. You want to be able to generate high-dimensional objects in a very broad sense.
What does that mean, high-dimensional objects?
So if you want to generate just a name, for example, a Roman name or the name of a location in England, made up, it is a fairly low-dimensional problem. Something like 10 dimensions, 20 dimensions, depending on whether you're counting the number of letters or syllables. But it is, all in all, it is relatively small-ish. If you want to generate a piece of text that is like 1 page long, we are talking of something like a few thousand dimensions. If you want to generate an image, 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, then you will be facing something like a million dimension, actually 3 million if you want to have like the three primary colors. So that's a lot more. And by the way, Stable Diffusion, the initial iteration, was only limited to 512 by 512 in terms of capacity. And they are now actually improving it. But you see, this sort of dimensionality was something that was one big challenge. And by the way, on the text front, that was pretty much the same sort of problem. The dimension plays, from the text perspective, in in two directions. The sort of amount of text that you can have as input as a prompt, it's generative. So the idea is that here is the beginning, please continue. So the question is that can you, as an input, use a piece of text that is only like one line long, or can you use something that is like multiple paragraph long, or even multiple pages long? So there is this sort of dimension. And then in terms of generation, how far can you go text-wise before having the generator losing on completely any consistency with itself? So you see, those models are limited in the sense that they cannot generate end-to-end an entire book, while with the end being consistent with the beginning. And if we go for text generation, one of the challenge is precisely to go through those higher dimensions where if you generate one sentence, if you generate just one word, you just have to be consistent on a super local level. If you do one sentence, you have to be consistent at the scale, maybe 100 dimension of the sentence. Paragraph, you have to be consistent on a scale that is higher dimensions and higher and higher. And if it was like a book, you would have like, again, maybe millions or tens of millions of abstract dimensions. Obviously, when I say dimensions, you could also think of it as degrees of freedom. It's just the sort of complexity of the object that you're looking at. And that was pretty much the same problem with images. And so that was one front of progress, which is go for things that are of higher dimensions, very broadly speaking, and maintain the consistency. Because again, if you divide the thing, then you obtain, two. It's much easier to generate two small images as opposed to one that is bigger and consistent. So that's the thing. When I say those bigger dimensions, I mean still being entangled and consistent. And the second front was genericity. Are you talking of a generator that is specific of a very narrow problem, or is it like a generator that can tackle anything? And the interesting thing, and this is not exactly a breakthrough of last year, but this is a breakthrough of the last, let's say, 5 years, is it has been as part of this deep learning movement, it has been the deep learning community has made enormous progress at leveraging absolutely gigantic data sets. If it was text about anything, the Wikipedia, web forums, TextOfLaw, anything they could, get their hands on, and thus have a generator that, when correctly prompted, can generate anything from poetry to legalese to code or to even general advice, and same with images, to have something that could generate anything from pixel arts to photorealistic take or views, with maybe like oil painting, in terms of style in the middle.
In terms of sophistication, when you talk about the dimensionality of these applications, how comparable are the outputs? For example, in ChatGPT, how comparable is an essay generated through ChatGPT compared to that which is generated by the average, let's say, university-educated person? I mean, are they comparable levels of sophistication? Are we there yet?
So, in terms of sophistication, I mean, it's very difficult question to answer, because we would have to define and clarify what do we mean by sophistication.
Well, actually, I can jump in there, like such that, somewhat like, let's say, the Turing test, such that you might not actually be able to determine whether it was generated by ChatGPT or by a student in a classroom, perhaps.
So, yes, I mean, right now, it depends, because those models, especially if we go for the text generator, text generator, it's the way it works right now is literally it is blending together enormous amount of an enormous corpus. And actually, some people have done some tests, and to a large extent, the thing that ChatGPT is going to write is literally cut and paste from stuff that is found somewhere on the web. I think the power of the model is to be able to glue that so that it's all correct from a grammatical, syntactical, perspective. But make no mistake, it's literally about identifying the sort of high-level statistical patterns that exist between words, group of words, sentences, to find, things that glue together in ways that are, from a statistical perspective, likely or credible. So, does it sound like a human? A lot, yes. But the reality is that what it generates, for a large part, you can literally find on the web entire bits that were taken from a website or whatever. So from this, if you have a tool that regurgitates, things that humans have written in a very, I'm not dismissing, the breakthrough. Being able to do that is already was incredibly difficult, because it's not about just cutting and pasting those phrases. It is to have the sort of high-level statistical dependency so that they can blend it together in ways that are credible. And that in itself is quite an achievement. However, when it comes to common sense, I think that was Yann Lequin, head of AI at Facebook, commented that none of those generators has the common sense of a cat yet. You see, that's the level of, there is literally no common sense whatsoever. It is statistical relationship, and you can have semi-hilarious situation where you ask very basic questions such as, how can I, avoid the traffic? That's something that I tested. The traffic jam in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the Atlantic Ocean, and then the thing would say, get a better route with a newer GPS or something, and they say, you kind of miss a joke. Again, that's you could see that it's literally high-level statistical relationship between pieces of text, gluing all of those data. All of those input corpus together.
It's actually, I believe it was also researchers at Amazon subjected ChatGPT to a battery of IQ tests and discovered that it was about a standard deviation below the norm, so about 83, which sounds kind of consistent with what you're saying here, just gluing pieces of information together that look like they go along or go together.
Yeah, but again, I think you're missing the point. I always say that, you see, even an incredibly dumb human, I mean, somebody who is not brain dead or in the hospital extra, is still vastly smarter than a cat, and yet, what Yann Lequin postulated, and I tend to agree, is that we are not even close to something that would be as intelligent as a cat. We are still very far. So, and you would say, oh, but my cat is completely incapable of telling me anything about, let's say, the theory of relativity. ChatGPT is able to do a fairly good job of giving me a couple of paragraphs of intro. And yes, because ChatGPT is literally going to cut and paste a nice summarization of this theory, because there are like thousands of instances of such summarization that can be found on the web. So it just blends them together and regurgitate. Doesn't mean it understands anything. And even, for example, a cat would understand that if there is something that is that if you ask, the question, I'm literally going to give you an example about ChatGPT. If you ask ChatGPT something like, 3 cars need 2 hours to drive from the city of Paris to the city of Tours. If you have 6 cars, how much time does it take? And then the ChatGPT will tell you, well, 6 cars is twice as much as 3, so it's going to take like 4 hours. And so, and again, if you think about a cat, and the cat thinks, if I have a buddy, I want to go over there, it's going to take the same time, whether there is me or my buddy cat. That obviously the cat is not going to phrase the thing in ways that are as elaborate, but there is some understanding of those sort of very, very basic thing about that universe of like 3 dimension, that there is something that is like time flowing through and whatnot. Again, ChatGPT is incredibly impressive in its capacity, and same thing for Stable Diffusion, by the way.
Of course,
Again,
that's we're just using one example.
on the. But you could see that there is this sort of this sort of incredibly shallow understanding, because all that those models are doing is, I would say, high-dimensional blending of the input data. Maybe it's sufficient. Maybe with that, if we continue on this path further with even more elaborate model, maybe there is nothing more to intelligence but piling up those sort of recipes just on a grander scale. But I suspect the situation is more complicated than that. So I suspect that those way of research, those avenue of research, are more demonstrating once more, that has been the entire story of artificial intelligence, is to clarify what intelligence is not. And that has been like a journey. We went through this journey for the last 70 years or so.
Well, I think you said earlier that the current iteration of ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion, just generative AI, is about an order of magnitude better than previous iterations.
Yes.
How much better would the fourth iteration of ChatGPT have to be to bridge the gap you just described?
I mean, we don't know. We really don't know, because literally that's the thing. Whenever there is like the sort of breakthrough, and I believe here the real breakthrough was deep learning. Those are application of deep learning. So we have deep learning was a breakthrough. It was around 2011, 2012. That was the real mathematical conceptual breakthrough. That was deep learning. Mm-hmm. Then those are applications. And very, I would say, there was a whole series of insights that were gained through the last decade, but still, we don't really know what we're missing. It's still a very open question, and you should not think of it as a linear progression. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with intelligence, is that we don't know what we are missing. And once we establish, a new kind of techniques, it let us even revisit what intelligence means in the first place. If we go back a century, in the past, and you were to ask, how can you establish that one person has a superior intelligence? If you were to ask, professors in academia, they would say something like, well, if this person can invert a matrix or compute the first 20 digits of pi, this person has a superior intelligence. Nowadays, people would say, well, it's like a pocket calculator can do that. It is a completely mechanical task. There is no intelligence whatsoever in being able to compute the first 20 digits of pi. You have like super simple recipes that we call algorithms, and you can run them with a computer and get thousands of digits. It doesn't make you smart in any way. So again, that was a situation 1 century ago where what was considered as the true core reflection of human intelligence turned out to be, no, that was the easy part of mechanization. And nowadays, all those things of computers are literally 10 orders of magnitude or even 15 orders of magnitude better than humans at doing those calculations, but they are not intelligent at all. At least that I would say is the general consensus. Now, what we have discovered with this generation of AI with deep learning was that there was plenty of tasks that on the surface looked incredibly difficult or challenging, but might not reflect intelligence that much. And for example, ChatGPT, I think ChatGPT tells more about what intelligence is not compared to what it actually is. What it says is what ChatGPT, the way I see that is that those super fancy chatbot text generator, where it says that the amount of latent knowledge there is in the English language and all the human languages is actually enormous.
When you say latent knowledge?
So it means that, let's say we have this abstract thing which is all the sum total of the human knowledge. Mm-hmm. How much there is all the sort of databases that we have. For example, chemists have collected over the last century entire databases say what is exactly the properties of every single chemical compound. You know, so you have like entire database that says what is the resistivity of every single material that knows on Earth. What is the fusion point of every material on Earth? So you see, we have databases that collect, you know, knowledge in a very structured ways. We have maps, for example, that collect knowledge, you know, in other, that another form of way of I would say collecting the knowledge. But there is also some sort of latent knowledge in the language itself, because the words, the words that we use are, you know, reflect to a large degree the understanding that we have about the universe. You know, if we say, for example, that there is stars and planets, and that planets orbits around stars, it means that you've already kind of understood a lot of things about the universe. You know, by the way, when let's say the ancient Greeks were talking about stars and planets, they didn't have exactly the understanding that we have about exactly what are those stars. For example, to postulate that the sun is a star like all the other stars, that's something that, you know, that is now accepted in the and that is literally part of the vocabulary. You know, it's part of this. When I say this is part of this latent knowledge, is that if you look, if you were just to look at the definition given in a dictionary, just you would learn a lot about all that there is to be learned from all the modern sciences. You know, so the words themselves tells you about the state of the knowledge extra. And conversely, sometimes you can even see that having a word that is missing prevents some sort of knowledge from even existing. And it's a peculiar situation, but if I had to give one example of that, would be the book Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. So Nassim, the basic premise of the book was Nassim Taleb started to think about what is the actual opposite of fragile. Fragile is, in his own definition, something that is going to get worse when subject to chaos and disorder. You know, that's something that is fragile. And he was saying, being durable or hard or sturdy or whatever, it's not exactly the same thing. It just means that under chaos and disorder, it will decay or degrade at a slower pace. It will not, and Nassim Taleb was to wonder what would be the true opposite. The true opposite would be something that, when subjected to chaos and disorder, would get better, whatever it is, you know. And that was a very abstract perspective, but that was, and he came up with this word, anti-fragile, and created literally a whole new perspective on how to look at ecosystems, human societies, laws, plenty of things. But what I was saying here is that, you see, by having one word that was missing, there was tons of ideas that could not be properly expressed because there was this missing word in the middle. And by adding a word, you literally enrich your knowledge, although it is in a way that is hard to grasp, because the way you communicate the language is through the knowledge is through the language itself. So back to that is that back to my starting point is that this latent knowledge, what ChatGPT demonstrates brilliantly, is that there is an enormous amount of latent knowledge in the language itself. And also that explain why, for example, you know, let's say, as a politician, I give you 10 buzzwords of the day that are the causes that you want to defend, and you can just spin off a whole discourse based on that, and appear as saying things that are reasonably intelligent while saying absolutely nothing of substance. And that's very interesting, because that's also what ChatGPT does. I mean, you know, when you give the tool a prompt, it has this very strong tendency to glue together all of the sort of idioms, you know, in a broader sense, all the sort of so widely accepted thing that you're just widely accepted ideas that you're blending in what is kind of the common sense, the dominant established perspective on the case.
It's not innovating, essentially.
Yeah, and it's literally, again, imagine that you had someone who would only answer to your question by proverbs. Whatever the question would be, it's only a proverb. This killing two birds in one stone and whatnot. Just proverbs. ChatGPT does that, but better by just gluing together the sort of
platitudes.
Platitude, yeah, exactly. That's the absolute platitude generator. But due to the fact that he's able to glue platitude from literally every single domain, it is still fairly impressive because usually you're not even familiar with what would be a platitude in a domain you know nothing about. So that's the beauty of training your generator against a super massive data set that includes literally millions of pages of text from super diverse fields.
Well, when it comes to actually applying all of this, because we've set the table now,
yeah,
are there, in your opinion or your estimation, are there no useful applications of generative AI when it comes to, let's say, enterprise or supply chain?
So enterprise is like super broad, so I will probably stick with
the floor is yours.
with supply chain. For supply chain, I would say most likely no, not directly. Okay. But again, it is incredibly hard to predict the future. The reason why I'm inclined to think that this wave of generators will not have a massive impact on supply chain is that the beauty and the strength of those generators is that they tap into a massive pool of I would say ambient knowledge, which is basically the web with all those images that you can access for free, all those texts that you can access for free. But when it comes to the optimization of a supply chain, the data that is the most relevant data happens to be the data that you have, your transactional history. If you're selling, let's say, door frames, it doesn't really help you when it comes to supply chain planning to know tons of general things about door frames. Your sales history of last year of door frames tells you a lot more about what exactly should you order, what should you produce, how should you allocate the stock. So you see, the data that is most relevant is the one that is not exactly shared openly with the world. It is the data that exists in the silo of your company. So, and companies, unlike again, ChatGPT is distorted by the fact that those sort of tools are incredibly better whenever they're discussing things where there is a lot of materials that are publicly available online. If you discuss things that are just not, where just the sort of stuff that is published online is very thin, ChatGPT becomes very quickly, ignorant of that. So here, very concretely, I would say, if you think of the sort of method that could be used to do any kind of optimization, I'm not too sure, just because the sort of inputs are not there. Then those sort of tools could potentially become instrumental in supporting your development. For example, ChatGPT is actually quite good at helping you generating code snippets.
I was about to get to code in this next question.
So yeah, for coding, again, because that's generic language, so language means sequence of characters. ChatGPT can generate text, but also code. And due to the fact that there is like gigantic amount of code that is available online, mostly through GitHub, but through plenty of other places, you have massive code bases that are readily available for ChatGPT to train on, and thus ChatGPT is actually capable of composing halfway decent code snippets or programs. And that's I would say, as a productivity tool for programmers, yes, there is a lot of potential. Beware, the code that ChatGPT generates can be as bogus as the code written by human. You know, it's I would not use that if you have without very careful supervision. If you want to engineer, you know, the next generation of autopilot for an aircraft or for a car. But fundamentally, yeah, as a productivity tool, it can be very efficient. Also, I suspect that the sort of technology that will come out will be things like meeting minute records of meetings. You know, stuff were discussed for 2 hours in a room. Can you summarize what was said in something like 2 pages, while preserving the maximum amount of details about what was said? Right now, I'm not too sure that ChatGPT would be able to do that, because again, that there is this sort of dimension problems. You would need to be able to summarize an amount of text that can be quite large, but similar sort of tools, you know, in the same vein, I'm pretty sure that within the next decade, we'll be able to do that. So for supply chain, there will be plenty of, I think, benefits. Although I suspect most of them will be kind of on the fringe, you know, on the periphery. So that would be things to facilitate meetings, note-taking, just even better sort of better systems to proofread the documents and whatnot. You know, all those sort of things could help. But for the core problems, the challenge is the data, and those generators, they don't deal with data as it presents, as they present themselves in supply chains.
Aren't there other programs that are more specifically designed for coding? So, I mean, ChatGPT is a text-based generative AI, but there's GitHub Copilot that's designed to assist in coding. It can produce pretty decent coding by itself, no? Couldn't that be incorporated?
Those models are almost identical, you know,
Oh, okay.
almost identical. The sort of technology that is behind is incredibly close. I mean, it's literally the same sort of transformer architecture. It's just the corpus is slightly different. The sort of user experience is slightly different. The idea with GitHub Copilot is that you want at each keystroke provide an autocompletion. ChatGPT has this more as a UI that is much more oriented toward a dialogue. But again, this is really the sort of thin layer of plumbing that you put on top. Underneath, it's literally the same. And I suspect, and that is a trend, I suspect that the best tool for code completion will actually be built on a corpus that is broader than code. And that's interesting because there was a paper that was just published a few days ago by a team at Amazon that showed that they have a very, very promising generator where they combine both image and text. And that's very interesting. So they unify, and the interesting thing that they claim, it's basically a paper by Zhang et al., and they claim that they achieve, they even claim on a few KPIs, on a few benchmarks that they beat ChatGPT, and that they have comparable results on most of the other metrics. And I say that with a caveat, those metrics for those sort of generators are incredibly difficult, and establishing what is a good generator is a problem as difficult as crafting a generator. So, but nonetheless, what they claim is to have a generator that is as good as ChatGPT, but with 1 billion parameter, where ChatGPT has almost, you know, has 100 times more parameters. So it's interesting is that by blending more data, more diverse source of data, you can actually have a model that is more powerful and simpler. And that's, you see, that's a little bit of a paradox, is that, and I say it's a journey, is that, for example, the ChatGPT model is absolutely gigantic. We are talking of something that is like we are in the trillion parameter range, you know, 1,000 billions. But it's absolutely unclear whether you need such an enormous model. And by the way, one of the breakthrough of Stable Diffusion was, compared to the other models, was to have something that was literally 2 orders of magnitude faster and leaner compared to the generative adversarial network it did replace. Stable diffusion is only about 1 billion parameter. And that makes it very small. Comparatively, ChatGPT is enormous, but again, there is a team that was just a few days ago that claims that they have pretty much reproduced the sort of performance that you have with ChatGPT, except that they have a model that is much smaller, of the order of magnitude of 1 billion parameter. The billion parameter sort of target is interesting because that's pretty much what you can operate with a graphic card as commonly found on the notebooks and workstations nowadays. If you have like a fancy gamer, a graphic card for gaming, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, this kind of brings us back to the full circle to what I said right at the start or in the intro. Overall, is this a net positive or a net negative? Now, in the specific context of enterprise or even more granular supply chain, do you see this as this being generative AI? Do you see this as a distraction, a boon, or what?
So, I mean, as a general line of thinking, my take is that any progress in terms of science and technology is good. I don't have this sort of Lovecraftian perspective. Lovecraft had the author had a very intriguing perspective, very dark, where his take, and that's in his novel, was that there are some profound or deep truth of the universe that are so brutal and so hostile to the human mind that if you discover them, you go insane. And that there is this danger lurking that if you go too deep, you are going to be driven insane by this sort of deeper reality of the universe that is more than the human mind can handle. My take is not a Lovecraftian one. Mm-hmm. I believe that generally it is a good thing. It is certainly better than ignorance. Now, like any tool since the Stone Age, the first hammer can be engineered to hunt an animal or to kill your fellow human. So this has been, the problem with technology and can be misused has been, a problem for thousands of years. So those sort of tech can also be misused. The sort of probable misuse are going in the realm of supply chain enterprise software. Mm-hmm. Are going to be an increase of confusion.
Because the noise.
Vendors are already hyping AI like crazy, and now they will even be able to tune the thing up to 11 by having their marketing department just spin endless fake case studies and whatnot. In the past, my take was creating a fake case study. It was taking some effort, like 4 hours of work. And by the way, you can fake it entirely because, nobody is ever going to check your claims. Most of your claims are impossible to verify. And as I described in my lecture, nobody in a case study has any incentive to say that all the millions that you claim to have saved or earned or generated or whatever are fake. Everybody that is part of a case study has like a massive incentive to say, yeah, all those benefits are true, and it's all thanks to me, at least in part, if we manage to achieve all of that. So my take is that the situation will be even more muddy because those teams are going to go berserk and generate even more bogus case studies and claims and vapid pages that describe their tech. Interesting things. I've spent some time to go on the website, for example, of many of the Lokad competitors. The interesting things is that you can have entire pages of text where when you read, I go to the technology page, I read, they say AI for supply chain, and then they have a page with, let's say, 3,000 words. So it's like, like if you were to print it, that would be 10 full pages of text. So it's, okay, and I read it, and at the end I say, okay, I haven't learned anything. They have managed to spin platitude or stuff that it's almost an art, that doesn't give away anything about what is it they're actually doing.
Flimflammery is what we say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, my take is I'm trying to stay informed about what my peers, generally speaking, are doing, and I'm always a bit baffled when I go through like a 10 pages long, you know, documentation about an AI for supply chain, and at the end, I can't say anything about what it is, what it does, why it was engineered that way, or you know, what is the sort of insights that are presiding at this thing. So that's kind of baffling. I suspect that in the past it took, you know, days for marketing teams to come up with this sort of flim-flam description.
I love that
Nowadays, ChatGPT, produce me, please, ChatGPT, I have a super innovative AI for supply chain. Give me a 10-page description of the tech, and ChatGPT will, you know, will comply and generate that.
So are you saying that there are essentially, as a way or a mechanism of establishing the veracity of this content, are you saying that there's essentially anything that claims, oh, we have AI in our supply chain optimization, that's bogus on its face?
Mostly, yes.
So it's an easy way to find out.
Not because AI is bogus, because
in this context.
I mean, even when we say generative AI, if you look at the papers, you know, Stable Diffusion or ChatGPT, I mean, the papers have very, very specific titles, like using a hierarchical architecture from this and that and that. I mean, they have usually long descriptive titles. Those techniques, you know, have names. The people who operate in the space don't say, I'm doing AI. They would say, I am using a transformer architecture coupled with a generative adversarial network coupled with a hierarchical this and that.
They would be precise, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, they need terms to just describe what they're doing. And the community, it's an emergent process. But again, the community come up with some sort of terminology to describe what is it that they're doing. And thus, when people can't be bothered into actually describing what is it that they have, if you go to, let's say, and again, just take it a step back for a moment and say, you know, a position. You want to buy, let's say, a window for your house. The person is say, okay, do you want aluminum, wood, plastic for, you know, surrounding the frame? Do you want like one glass or
one
two?
pane or two or yeah.
I mean, they would have, you know, some sort of semi-precise description. And if someone would say, you know what, I'm selling windows, generic, no detail whatsoever. Yeah. No, sorry, I can't tell you if it's like wood or aluminum or whatever.
It's a window.
It's a window, yeah. Trust me, but a good one. You would say, that's weird. You know, people usually they add. And if you were to ask about the window, people would be giving you, you know, some sort of technical specification. They would not say it's a sustainable window. And I say, okay, what's a sustainable window? You know, they would not
add more buzzwords.
But as well say, you know, I would say with regard to light, our window is absolutely excellent. Oh, yeah, I mean, again, that's
what ChatGPT would say.
Yes, and that's a sort of weird, sort of circumvented way to describe that. So I think those sort of tools will add more confusion also because first vendors will use that to generate marketing materials, but also because they can actually include very easily those tools into their tech stack while doing nothing of substance. I mean, it is super straightforward to plug those sort of things, you know, into an existing software architecture, but it's going to be a gadget. You know, if your existing software architecture has not been designed to really make the most of what those sort of tech can offer, it's just going to be a gadget. It is in software. It's always kind of easy to duct tape one more piece. Doesn't mean that it's going to make, you know, any difference or that it's going to be any useful. So where I think it will confuse further is that it will give one more opportunity also to vendors to actually plug some sort of real real deal, true, algorithms, fancy algorithms of real value, but in ways that are nonsensical and that in the end, as far as their solution is concerned, doesn't add any value. And that's also another problem. And that would not be the first time. We went already through several iterations of those sort of things with operation research 50 years ago, and then data mining, and then data science, and now there will be those cognitive AI or whatnot, the way they will be framed. And again, the problem is, my take is that if you want to make the most of this sort of tech, as a piece of enterprise software, you cannot duct tape. It has to come at the design level of your product. Is the very core design that you cannot change after the fact. That's the problem with the core design of the products, that it's something that you can only do at the beginning. You can't. It becomes exceedingly hard to do after the fact. You can't just duct tape that into your product after the fact.
Well, what would be an example of like that core design level that you're discussing, or that you're mentioning? Excuse me.
Again, that would be that if you have a system where your core, at the core of your system, you have a transactional database. So a transactional database is to do transactions. So to get transactional integrity, well, it's very good and fine, but you see, this design is not going to do anything to leverage any kind of image or text generator. It's completely at odds in the sort of transactional perspective. You're dealing with transactions. Having some sort of tool that can generate text or image, it's not even the same realm. So you see,
it's different languages.
It's different paradigms. It doesn't. So what I'm saying is that having something that fits is absolutely not a given. It usually requires, extensive care about the design. So those very assumptions that weigh into the sort of guiding principle for your architecture, so that things fit at all. Otherwise, you're just on separate tracks. And in the software, what is misleading is that, again, it's always possible to have like one product and then have an add-on that sits on the side, but just it's absolutely not properly integrated, not connected, and there is not any kind of synergy by having those two things side by side. You just have a more complicated mess with more moving parts, more bugs.
So overall, and on the balance of powers, just avoid trying to integrate it into supply chain optimization, supply chain procedures.
My take would be, if a vendor comes forward with that, you really need to probe what is it that you're doing. And that would be maybe my parting advice for the audience would be, make sure if you read the technology page of this vendor that it makes sense to you. You don't have, by the way, you don't have to be an expert. No. If the vendor is not capable of conveying in a way that is sensical what is it that the technology is and what it does, and what sort of techniques it uses, it's most likely a fraud. I've never seen in my entire career. It is such an achievement to be able to do that. Then when people who are not fraud manage to do it, they are more than happy, to put that on display for the world to witness their greatness at doing something very difficult. There is this part of the ego that comes into play. And by the way, that is true for all those models, Stable Diffusion, ChatGPT, etc. All of those, great achievements, all the sort of, those things are public. There have been like papers published about that. Those are not well-kept secrets. On the contrary, the companies who managed to get to this point of having those technical achievements, they published very detailed papers about how they can achieve that. And that is a very typical behavior. And so my take is that would be the parting advice, is that I believe that there is a lot of value, but AI is just a buzzword, and you can fit pretty much anything under this umbrella. So whenever a vendor approaches you, you need to get to the bottom of what is it that they do. And if the person who is selling to you do not know, Do not, and by the way, do not trust a vendor if the guy says, I'm just a salesperson, it's a tech team. I don't know. No. If people say that, that means that there is no technology whatsoever. That's the I would say, decade-old, time-tested technique of say, you know what, we hire Nobel Prizes, we have Einsteins on the back, but yeah, no, you're not going to meet a lot of smart people, trust me. Those people are so smart. So, but don't worry, the tech is incredibly good. Yes, I know nothing, but
trust me.
It's just me. I'm the vendor, I'm the sales guy. The rest of the team, they're so good. No. That's almost guarantees that there is nothing in the back. It's just more of the same.
Boom. Well, on that note, thank you, Joannes. I've learned quite a bit. Thank you for your time, and thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.